you going to use your computer at all? Yes. For your notes, right? Oh, you're gonna put it in front of you. Yeah. Okay. I don't think I have it on charge. Okay, well, there are like. Like what, a few minutes to charge. You can stand here and talk if you want. No problem with that. Oh, really? Yeah, sure, but nobody's gonna be able to see us. Thing. Oh, no, I'll be there. It's fine. But it's just I updated the software. I know that's a nightmare to go through. They did that. The battery life is just not the great anymore. I think my understandable because you're skipping front end. Tell you what, you could put it here maybe. So you can like test, but because you're going to be holding the microphone anyway. Yeah, but also that's the sound. You can put it here if you want. Right here. Would you like to see it? Yeah. Like this, would you be able to read? Yeah. All right. Just get out of your way, right?
ياسمين.
Hey, Madalena.
مين؟
عمرو سامعني كده؟
أنا سامعك كويس. الدنيا تمام عندك؟
we started recording خلاص كده ماشي؟
طب أنت فاتحة ريكوردينج بدري قوي كده ليه؟
يعني 5 دقايق مش مشكلة أضمن.
الدنيا تمام يعني مهم.
مش مشكلة. تمام؟
الدنيا تمام؟
أنا كده زي الفل يعني شغالة حلوة قوي. أنت شايف الشاشة ورايا شايف؟
أنا شايف الشاشة كويس.
والصوت عندك واضح وكل حاجة خلاص.
بس لو هتعرضي برزنتيشن يا ريت تعملي له شير من على الزوم.
أنا يا هعمل شير يا أخليها زي ما هي حسب.
لو زي ما هي مش هتبان قوي، أو افتحي لي كده البرزنتيشن أشوفه.
أنت عايز ما هي مفتوحة
لا أنا قصدي اللي أنت تعرضيه على الشاشة بس البروجيكتور عشان أشوفه واضح ولا لا، عشان لو مش واضح الأحسن اللي أنت تعملي له شير.
هي كانت مفتوحة يعني كده فاتحة أول سلايد.
طب قلبي كده السلايد. دوسي كليك على الشاشة، دوسي كليك على الشاشة، دوسي كليك على الشاشة.
دي؟
عشان بس الاكتف بتاع الكليكر يشتغل. تمام. بصي هو الكلام مش واضح قوي.
يبقى انا هضطر اعمل شير سكرين في الحالة دي صح؟
يفضل بصي يستحسن تعملي شير.
خلاص هعمل كده ماشي خلاص يا عمرو اوكي. تسلم.
اوكي.
لما تيجي تتكلم هعمل شير سكرين اسهل بكتير.
بالظبط.
خلاص ماشي هعمل تسلم ميرسي. Very good.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, my fellow Philadelphia resident is here, Rachel. Welcome to you all. I'm Professor Mark Deets, and I am the director of the Alwaleed Center for American Studies and Research here at the American University in Cairo. So welcome. We're really excited about this. This is our first event of the fall semester. And we're really excited about this talk and this guest, and we're really delighted that you're here with us today. Before I go on too much, though, I want to mention that the person who really runs this center is Yasmin, as Madalena, who also helps us, well knows. The person who really makes this center work is Yasmin, and it was her birthday on Monday, and I'm not going to make you sing happy birthday to her or embarrass her, but if you want to wish her a happy birthday after the talk, that would be nice. Anyway, I'm really grateful for all of her help with the center and in making this talk happen. So for those of you who don't know, the Alwaleed Center for American Studies and Research was established in 2003 by Prince Alwaleed from the Saudi royal family, who after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, wanted to build cross-cultural understanding between the Middle East and the West. And so he established 6 study centers, if you will, at different universities. And so the idea was to establish American Studies Centers at 2 universities here in the Middle East. One is here at AUC, the other is at AUB in Beirut, and then Middle East Studies Centers in England and in America. So there's Middle East or Islamic Studies Centers at Edinburgh, and then also at Cambridge in the UK. And then in America, there's Islamic Studies Centers at Harvard and Georgetown that were established by him. So anyway, we're a part of this network, and now this network also includes NYU, Abu Dhabi, for example, and we're still excited to be a part of that. So actually, you know, the guy whose name is on the side of this building, with that money, first of all, built this building, but second, created this study center, which is in the middle. If you want to come see us sometime, our offices are actually on the other side of TBS from here, right next to TBS. And so today we're really excited to have with us Zefi. She goes by Zefi, but her name is Zefitret Molla. She's a doctoral researcher in political science at Freie Universität Berlin, whose academic journey has been notably international. Actually, I would say her entire life has been notably international. She holds a Bachelor of Laws in French Law and Political Science from Université Jean Moulin, Lyon III in Lyon, France, and an additional certificate in American law from the same institution. Her master's degree in migration studies was earned at the University of San Francisco, where she also completed an exchange semester at the Colegio Mexico, I believe, right? In Mexico City, or Universidad Iberoamericana. Is that the same thing? Iberoamericana? Okay. Okay. Her research and professional experiences include fieldwork with Afro-Mexican communities and Black migrants in Mexico, as well as a research associate position focused on immigration policy at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C. Zefi is fluent in French, Amharic, and Spanish, and her education and research span France, the United States, Germany, and Mexico. Please join me in welcoming Zefi Molla to the podium at AUC.
Let me know if you can hear me. I keep hearing that I'm very like soft-spoken, so If at any point you can't hear me, just like let me know. But yeah, very excited to be here, and thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm originally from Ethiopia, so it's really nice to be back on the continent, even though it's like obviously there's like a couple of countries between us, but yeah. So today I will be talking about, you've probably heard on the news already, but about the suspension of the US Refugee Admissions Program. It's one of the many executive orders that President Trump signed on his first day in office in January 2025. And then we'll be talking about the implications for the Middle East and North Africa, and in general Africa, because these are the Middle East and Africa are the top, sending countries for refugees right now. Um,
Is it- Yeah, there we go.
So the US immigration system is one of the most complex immigration systems in the world. Since, the US was basically like became a country, like we've had a series of open as well as restrictive immigration policies. The most recent one was in the second half of the 20th century. We witnessed, one of the most, I guess, open immigration policies in US history, the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. Following this 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, in 1980, the Refugee Act was signed. So this act basically changed how US refugee admissions works in the US. It created a uniform procedure for refugee admissions. Before 1980, this doesn't mean that there weren't refugees coming into the US. It was just not in a uniform manner. So after World War II, for instance, a lot of refugees were resettled from mostly countries that were annexed by the Soviet Union. After the Vietnam War, a lot of people from that region, including a lot of Vietnamese refugees, were resettled, but these were more of one-off programs. So, the president or Congress, in consultation with Congress, would create a sort of program to let a certain amount of refugees in, but it wasn't a uniform procedure. So in 1980, this was signed by the president at the time, Jimmy Carter, and the idea was to also remove refugees from an immigration preference system. So this preference system, once the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act kind of ended the U.S. refugee program, the U.S. immigration program that kind of benefited more people from Europe, we had an immigration preference system, so only a certain amount of people from certain countries could enter the country at a given time. With the Refugee Act, refugees were kind of taken out of this program, so the limits that on the number of refugees that could come in was set by the president on a yearly basis. As I mentioned, it amended the Immigration and Nationality Act. It also granted the president authority to admit additional refugees when there are emergencies. This happened, for instance, in 2015 with the war in Syria. Obama at the time was able to admit a certain number of refugees on top of the ones that had already been decided at the beginning of the year. In the past 45 years, 3 million refugees have been admitted to the US, which sounds like in a way a big number, but also in a way, like compared to the amount of people who are refugees or have been displaced, it's a very small number. But you can kind of go over that later on. So how does it exactly work on the ground? So a couple of agencies, including US Citizenship and Immigration Services of the Department of Homeland Security, the Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration, which is also part of the Department of State, they all work together to admit refugees into the US. Refugees, unlike asylees, are processed from abroad. Asylees, it's basically anyone who either presents themselves at one of the 328 ports of entries, US ports of entries, or anyone who enters the US on any visa and then seeks asylum, whereas refugees, they're admitted from abroad through a very lengthy process. Refugees are also required to apply for their green card or legal permanent residence once they're in the US. Unlike asylees who technically, once they're granted asylum status, they're not required to, but they're encouraged to apply for their green cards. So refugee admissions over the years has changed. This is still the lowest we've seen though. This year's 2025 is the lowest in the 45 years of the US Refugee Admissions Program. So when the program was initially created in 1980, over 200,000 refugees were admitted that year. Over the 1980s, you know, like the numbers kind of changed depending on which region of the world or which countries needed to have refugees admitted. In the 1990s, refugee admissions spiked. This was partly because, you know, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and like with the fall of like in general, like the Soviet Union bloc, a lot of people fled those parts of the world and were admitted as refugees. As you can imagine, after 2001, refugee admissions was briefly suspended, despite, you know, what President Trump says today, but there have always been security measures in place to vet people and make sure that, you know, like it's a very lengthy process. It takes up to 2 years for people to be able to be resettled, up to 2 years after they submit their, after they're selected for refugee status. But after 2001, you know, the security measures were kind of like ramped up. And in the early 2010s, because of efforts by, at the time it was Obama, because of efforts by Obama administration, there was a rise in refugee admissions and so on. In 2017, at the time, we all thought this was the lowest it could get, because between 2017 and 2021, this was the lowest refugee admissions we had seen in the history of the program within consecutive 4 years. So, you know, the refugee admission ceiling would be set to maybe 45,000, 50,000, and then the actual number of admitted would be 15,000, 20,000. But Trump never ceases to amaze us. So actually, now it's even lower than we could have imagined. Refugee admission ceilings are set by the president on a yearly basis. So, for example, during Obama, refugee admission ceilings could be set up to 125,000 per year. This doesn't mean that necessarily 125,000 people were admitted that year. It just means like that's the maximum number they could admit. A lot of times, the number of people admitted were lower than the actual ceiling that was set by the president. Before the Biden-Harris administration, in their last year in office, they were able to admit over 100,000 refugees. So before I go into Trump 1.0 and like Trump 2.0, as people call it in DC, just this is kind of like an example of like a visual representation of how refugee processing works. Most of the time, refugees register with UNHCR or they're referred by UNHCR or an NGO or a US embassy. Then they go through one of the resettlement support centers, which does pre-screening interviews. There's 7 resettlement support centers across the world. Then they go through a very lengthy DHS vetting process. And this process includes, you know, security checks with all the intelligence agencies you can imagine in the US, including the FBI. Once that's done, they also go through medical checks. You've probably heard of this, but until 2008, for example, like people who had been, you know, like with their medical checks, if, you know, people find out that they do have HIV, they were usually barred from entering the US as a refugee unless, you know, sometimes there would be waivers, but Congress amended that in 2008. Then they have a USCIS officer in-person interview, and then the USCIS makes the final determination. And finally, they're able to be admitted into the US. So this takes about 18 months to 2 years, but this doesn't take into account the amount of time a lot of people have spent in either refugee camp or in, you know, like waiting for basically resettlement in like could be Egypt, could be any country in the region. This is just a visual representation because I think there's like right now there's talks about, you know, like people who are resettled as refugees don't go through a vetting process, but the vetting process is actually one of the, you know, the longest that any immigration program like has in the US. And a lot of these people go through so many vetting processes, so many medical checks. So it's not like, you know, people can just like show up. But so the argument that, you know, like the reason the refugee admissions program was suspended is because it's unsafe or because, you know, we're letting everyone in is actually not true. This is just so you get an idea of the refugee processing priorities. There are 3 different priority levels. Priority 1 is when, resettlement is the most appropriate and durable solution. And they're usually referred by these agencies, and all nationalities are eligible. With priority 2, these are specific groups of specific humanitarian concern to the US. They're determined by the administration every year. In the last couple of years, it was usually, Iraqis or Afghans or anybody who could fit in this specific humanitarian group criteria. They don't need referrals most of the time. And priority 3 is family reunification. Let's say you were resettled in the US as a refugee, and sometimes when people are filling out their refugee resettlement process, or when they're being referred by UNHCR, they don't realize that maybe they didn't fill out their kid with them, or maybe their kid was like, because resettlement or having a refugee status doesn't mean that all the family leaves at the same time. Maybe you're in one country and then your daughter is in another country, and you don't get to be resettled at the same time. So once you're in the US, you're able to apply for your kids or your spouse or any other family member. This is limited to designated nationalities. So eligibility is, you need to be a refugee, you need to be recognized as a refugee by the Immigration and Nationality Act. You need to not have been resettled in another country. And you also need to be otherwise admissible to the US. So this kind of goes back to all the security checks and health checks that I was mentioning. There are some specific grounds of inadmissibility. So this has happened before where, like terrorism related grounds this is a very open, I guess, very broad way of looking at it, because it can mean like, you have a family member that maybe has some sort of connection. This could be used as, a terrorism related ground. So it's a very broad definition. National security cases as well as a very broad, little too broad definition. And communicable disease, until very recently, it also included HIV, but it doesn't anymore. Once they're in the US, refugees have access to reception and placement program funding. This funding is for 3 months. So when you arrive in the US for 3 months, you get a refugee resettlement agency helps you settle into the US. Usually this includes cultural orientation, language orientation, helping you fill out, any paperwork that you need to, maybe getting your work permit. But 3 months is not enough. If you're coming from, like, I don't know, some small town in Ethiopia, and you arrive in Maryland, I think it's just really hard for people to like navigate. But 3 months is like the amount of time that the US government has allocated to these sorts of services. Once those 3 months are all over, they do get refugee cash assistance and some sort of medical assistance as well. So these are the top countries of origin of not just refugees, but asylees. So this is basically the largest shares from MENA, the largest shares of people who obtained their legal permanent resident status in the US in the last couple of years, after having changed their status from either refugee or asylee, are from these 4 countries. This doesn't mean that it's always been like that, but it's migration patterns change. A couple of years ago, or at least in the 90s, it might have been more like, maybe like Lebanese. And but in the last couple of years, these are the top 4 countries, not just for refugees, asylees as well. Now jumping into Trump 101, 1.0. So during Trump's first presidency, the Refugee Admissions Program was suspended temporarily. So from, it was once again, it was one of the first executive orders that was signed, but the impact was much less than this round. It was, we did see one of the lowest refugee admission ceilings in history, 45,000, 35,000, but also one of the lowest refugee admissions in history, even though the ceilings were maybe set at 40, 50K. In reality, the admissions were much lower. They also ceased providing resettlement authorization to affiliate offices, which means that refugee resettlement centers in the US tend to have offices all across the country. And about 40% of the offices were forced to close during Trump's first presidency, which means when Biden finally was trying to kind of rebuild the US Refugee Admissions Program, it took a couple of years to be able to resettle the same amount of refugees that we were resettling during the Obama administration, because the system had been completely dismantled. So we had to reopen offices, had to put in more funding. There were also obviously travel ban on several Muslim majority countries, which did indirectly also affect the US Refugee Admissions Program. Now coming to Trump 2.0. So before the Biden administration left office, the way, I guess the way refugee resettlement works is every year the president, in consultation with Congress, sets a certain number of, like goal for the next year. So before the Biden administration left office, the goal had set the ceiling to 120,000 refugees. I think everyone in DC knew that this was not, it was kind of like a wishful thinking that, the Trump administration, we knew that the first thing that they would do would be like to sort of like dismantle it. But a lot of people still had, flights scheduled. Some people were meant to arrive actually like on January 21st or 22nd. So literally a few days after Trump was in office. So in January 2025, the program was suspended indefinitely. This also means that resettlement agencies received stop work orders. Special immigrant visas, Afghan special immigrant visas, were technically not affected by the suspension of the refugee admissions program, because their SIVs are not, they're not part of the refugee admissions program. But because one of the orders does affect foreign aid, it means like the flights that, special immigrant visa recipients could use were actually halted. So people could come with their own, like if they were able to pay for their own flights, but a lot of times they're not. So, or a lot of times it means like, from Afghanistan to, or from wherever they were in the region to the US, it would cost at least $1,000 per person. Some of these families were, not necessarily 2 or 3 people families, but larger families, and they could not afford to pay for the flights. So this is also a broken promise to, Afghan allies. The administration also ended cooperation agreements with all 10 resettlement agencies, which not only meant that new refugees could not be resettled, but the refugees who had already arrived, let's say they arrived in December 2024 or November 2024, it means they were no longer able to access the 3 months of refugee reception and placement services they could have access to. It also means that SIVs who were also already in the country could no longer access those services either. Not only that, but with the stop work orders, the Trump administration for the first few months also refused to pay for the services that they had already agreed to. So the government had already agreed to pay for some services in December or November, and all these agencies had submitted receipts and they actually didn't get paid for a few months. So a lot of people were laid off. And as you know, in the US, like sometimes unemployment is not enough to cover your rent. So a lot of people had to get other jobs, which means they were no longer able to support the refugees that kind of were already in the country and kind of left stranded. There is an ongoing legal battle. And as you can imagine, the Trump administration obviously is appealing a lot of these decisions. But in February, so a lawsuit was filed on behalf of 3 refugee serving agencies and 9 impacted individuals. So these individuals were either people who had applied for family reunification. So one of the cases was it was a refugee from Congo who had family members waiting in South Africa and who was actually supposed to fly within a few weeks. Some of them were the Biden administration has created this Welcome Corps program. This program basically allowed sponsorship programs. So families in the US were not necessarily refugee families, but any family who wanted to sponsor refugees, they could. And so some of the impacted individuals were them, or one of them was an Iraqi refugee who had worked with the US with the US Army, with the US military, and was waiting to be resettled. So they filed a lawsuit. The preliminary injunction was granted, but they still had to wait a few months. At the same time as the Trump administration was blocking resettlement for mostly Black and brown refugees, In May 2025, the first group of white South Africans were resettled in the US. Their resettlement was very different from any sort of resettlement the country has ever seen. They were able to come on a US government chartered flight, which usually most refugees don't come on a chartered flight. They just come on a regular flight. They were also received by the Deputy Department of Homeland Secretary. And the process was really fast. Usually, as I mentioned earlier, the process takes 18 months to 2 years. But for them, between the moment they submitted their application and the moment they were resettled, it was only a few months. Right now, the US Embassy and Consulate in South Africa continues to conduct interviews for racial minorities, i.e. like white South Africans who want to be resettled into the US, but all other resettlement options for anyone else is blocked. Because of the court orders, resettlement agencies were able to partially resume reception and placement services. So for SIVs or for refugees who have already arrived, some of the services became available. And some plaintiffs who were part of the first basically lawsuit were able to be resettled. So this is about 80 people out of at least 10,000 who had already flights booked, and thousands more who they didn't have their flights booked, but they were supposed to maybe fly in March, in April, in May. And a lot of them had already left their jobs, had already, canceled their leases, had already sold any property or, anything they had because they were moving to the US. So the lawsuit was off to a great start, but unfortunately last Friday, the courts paused the preliminary injunctions, which means right now no one is able to be resettled. So this year, only about 80 people have been resettled to the US, aside from the white South Africaners, which would be, I guess, a little over 100. In protest, some organizations are actually thinking of basically ending their partnership with the US government, but others, are continuing to resettle because whoever it is, this is kind of like we're resettling whoever the government is sending us. For 2026, there are reports that the administration is going to announce the new refugee admissions target by October 1st. We don't know what's going to be in the report yet, but the sources basically are saying that it's probably going to, the focus is going to be on white South Africans, but anybody else is probably going to be barred from refugee admissions. But, the hopes are like that we're wrong and that, people are going to be let in. And in the meantime, people are still waiting to see if, the courts will decide otherwise. But if it does get to the Supreme Court, the chances of losing are really high. In terms of the impact on MENA, so MENA immigrants are more likely than others to obtain their legal permanent residence as refugees or asylees. I didn't really cover that much asylees in this talk, but the asylum system as we know it is also being, little by little dismantled. It's practically impossible to, access asylum at the US-Mexico border. There aren't that many MENA refugees who come there except Afghans. Like if you look at the data by the Mexican Interior Ministry, you do see that there's been an uptick in the number of Afghan people who are presenting themselves at the US-Mexico border, but they're also not able to access the US asylum system. MENA refugees, along with Africans, they, in general, I guess, also sub-Saharan Africa, they're the second largest group of resettled refugees in recent years. This also means prolonged family separation with no end in sight. So a lot of these families have already been separated for maybe 8 years, 10 years, but this means the separation is going to continue, but there's no end in sight, unlike the first round or Trump 1.0. A lot of these refugees are forced to remain in danger. It also means increased economic strain on refugee camps in MENA. Because along with dismantling the US Refugee Admissions Program, the Trump administration has also decreased or almost ended, I guess, any sort of foreign aid to, you've probably heard in the news, foreign aid has also come to a halt. So it's just, refugee camps don't have as much money, UNHCR doesn't have as much money, but then people are also being forced to stay in these camps or stay in vulnerable situations. A lot of activists and immigrant advocacy rights are also afraid that This is actually going to sort of incentivize other countries in the West to reduce, the number of refugees they want to resettle. I live in Germany. We're already seeing it in Germany. Germany is going to cut their foreign aid as well in the next coming year. The Netherlands as well. France, well, they've actually been struggling for a while, so they've been doing this for a while. But even like Germany, who this is the first year they're going to cut any sort of aid. This is kind of like, just so you get an idea of the top 10 countries of origin of displaced persons in 2025. A lot of these countries are in this region, so this suspension of the US Refugee Admissions Program is going to disproportionately affect countries in the Middle East and North Africa. Also because even though on the news we do see that, like a lot of people come from like Central and South America, a lot of them were not really eligible to begin with to the US Refugee Admissions Program until Biden, which expanded a little bit the program. So honestly, the US Refugee Admissions Program suspension is technically an attack on this region more than any other region. So in terms of, this is very wishful thinking from my part, to be honest. I think the advocates right now, they're not really talking about rebuilding the refugee admissions program. And it might also be because I'm 29, so I'm still like, there's hope. There's still like so many years left. But the last time around when, like Trump 1.0 happened, like a lot of advocates were talking about how we could rebuild the system. And in 2017, a lot of the system was dismantled. In 2021, first year in office, the Biden administration did put in a lot of effort to rebuild the admissions program. One of the things they did was expand overseas refugee adjudication capacity. The Welcome Core program, which is a very unique program in the US, was also created. And I think, if we do have a post-Trump, that is one of the things that the next administration could do, is like restore and expand the program, but also in terms of funding, really like ramp up funding, not only internationally, but also internally, so that domestic resettlement capacities can go back to the levels they were, or even better, to be honest. And also improve refugee vetting efficiencies. There are ways to be efficient without the refugee vetting process not taking 2 years. Like right now it's on average 2 years, but it's 2 years after you start the process. This doesn't take into account the amount of time you spent before. Yeah, I'm done.
All right. Well, thank you, Zefi. That was a really intriguing talk. So now we have time for Q&A. And do we have another microphone? Okay. And if you don't mind, we'll bring the microphone to you because was this being recorded?
Yes.
Okay. So I believe this is being recorded. It's going to be posted on our Facebook page. And so we ask you to use the microphone not only to help everybody in the room hear you, not that we really need it in this room, but really it's more for the recording. So questions for Zefi?